The topic of this afternoon is the broad topic of science, and there's no two better people on the planet Earth that can join us for this panel than Bret Weinstein and Robert Malone, two great heroes from. So, come on, have a seat. Yeah, here and here, here and here. Two of you can sit down, and I'll just introduce the topic by just quickly describing some of the prehistory here. Going into the public revelations of SARS-CoV-2, there was a controversy concerning how science should respond to it. And I and my colleagues dug through the history of public health and pandemics and had discovered the prevailing consensus, which is that non-pharmaceutical interventions, particularly extreme quarantines, much less universal quarantines, are unscientific and have failed in every conceivable way. The Cochrane Review had been maintaining random controlled trial meta studies for 20 years that had proven this over and over again about masks and distancing, and Donald J. Henderson had written back in 2006 a masterful treatise refuting everything from universal showering and hand sanitizer and masking and travel restrictions and quarantines in the work, saying none of the stuff is effective for controlling a virus. And the people who strongly believed in the science had accepted this as orthodoxy. And in fact, in late February, I'm going to say February 28th, Yale University sent out, the public health department of Yale University sent out a communique to this effect, signed by 800 public health scientists, saying that whatever you do, don't use extreme measures that violate people's rights. That will accomplish nothing from a public health point of view. And everybody was signed up and said, yes, that's exactly right. 2 weeks later, suddenly, all the things that the science had recommended against, insisted against, became the orthodox practice. And all the people who signed, that all 800 people, shut up instantly. Okay, so this letter from Yale, do you remember this letter? Yeah. So something happened, and very quickly, the science changed. And we heard Deborah Birx from the podium at the White House instructing all the media present, oh, you have seen the data. You know that all this stuff is what science is. And then Fauci claimed that he was a science, and the people that in a partisan way favored all the lockdowns began to support their scientific credentials by, for example, wearing, as one does, a mask with test tubes on it and things like that. That's how you show you're a partisan of science. And I live in a very blue town, and the signs were up all over town. In this house, we believe in the science. And also that water is water, and several other slogans. I don't really understand these signs, but it was a worry all along, because the thing that we've believed in for hundreds of years was put up on the mantle, and our rights were thrown out, and good sense was thrown out. And that, to me, has had a profound effect on the credibility of the thing that we believe built modernity itself. And surely that has consequences for us, I think, probably, and for the status of science. By way of introduction, too, let me also add to that I think we've all lived in a strange reality of gradually unfolding an understanding of what's happening around the world, to us and to our communities. And initially, I never really imagined that it was all about the vaccine, because I never could have imagined a state so sadistic as to lock down its population until there was a shot ready that was designed to vaccinate against a respiratory virus with zoonotic reservoir which had never been seen before. And even if such a thing could exist, it would surely take 10 or 15 years in trials before it was safe enough to distribute to the population. And in April of 2020, I got a phone call from Rajiv Venkaya, who himself believes he is the architect of pandemic planning from the Bush years. He worked for the White House. And he called me up and said, you need to shut up about lockdowns. It's becoming a problem. You need to get with the program. And I said, that's very interesting, not very likely, but I have one question. And the vaccine had not come up in the conversation at all at this point. I said, I have one question. After all of our bluster and our hiding out and our distancing and all the things we're doing, where does the virus go? I mean, it's a legitimate question I had, right? I couldn't follow the whole thinking here. Does it move to another planet? Well, this one doesn't like me. Jump into a hole in the ground and hide for another 100 years? I couldn't figure it out. And he told me on the phone, he said, we're going to stay locked down until we get a vaccine. And I said, well, that can't happen because that'll take 10 or 15 years. We can't stay locked down for 10 or 15 years because you'll be surprised it's going to come a lot faster than you think. And I said, no, this is a very interesting, but I have other things to do. I hung up and I thought, that guy's a crazy person, right? I just thought, this is some sort of has-been from the Bush years who has no idea what he's talking about because none of this stuff could possibly be true. It turned out that he was right, and he had told me this. And of all people to have told me this, it would have been Rajiv Venkaya, because he knew, he worked for a vaccine company that was working on the, and he's the guy who invented pandemic planning coming out of the bioweapons industry, okay? So he knew, but I thought it was so insane that he must have, you know, called me after his first cocktail or something. I didn't believe it. Anyway, that's my history of the science. Now we find ourselves plunged into a world in which we are trying to save science from itself or something along those lines. So we're going to go over this panel a little bit according to the schedule, just because I want to hear and leave as much time for Bret and for Dr. Malone to address this. And I'm not even going to start it with a question other than to say, do you have any comments on what I said? And in particular, I would like to hear from both of you your perceptions on the role of conflicts of interest in the funding of science. So, go.
So, conflict of interest. Fundamental principle is that we all have conflicts of interest. It's just a question of whether or not they're adequately managed. And proper management requires full disclosure. And full disclosure has not been the norm in the academic community. There's some that are very diligent in their disclosure, and there's some journals that require diligence in disclosure, some that have really increased their insistence on diligence in disclosure. The main journals seem to find that a concept which can be electively enforced, depending on circumstance and the status of the individual, is my assessment. So the conflict of interest has always been a huge problem. It's a major, major problem in the peer-reviewed process, both at the journal level and also at the grant and contract level. So it's rampant. There's all kinds of conflict of interest, and it's generally can't be managed. There's in many ways, whether nefarious or just circumstantial, to bypass it. Much of big science operates, in my experience, more as cabals and networks of people that have lines of connectivity and association having to do with who is a postdoc in whose lab. There's whole lineages. They kind of form little mafias.
Yeah.
And they will will surreptitiously cross-review their own cohorts' information or submissions or grant applications or whatever. And it's just kind of baked in. For me, it was one of the hardest things to come to grips with as a young scientist, young idealistic scientist. And it really hit the rubber for me when I was at the Salk. Time had, I think, 6 or 8 Nobel laureates. I thought I had reached the pinnacle of the academic tower, of the ivory tower. And what instead I found was it was kind of just grubby. And that these networks of affiliation really ran the whole thing. They ran the journals, they ran the financial arrangements, and it was just like I said, it's kind of like in the only words I can use to describe is like a mafia type relationship. So conflict of interest, rampant, widespread, very difficult to root out. Um,
Peer review is double blind, but also affected by.
Double blind. It depends on the journal.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think the most effective solution in peer review for academic manuscripts is that the reviewers actually disclose who they are.
Mm.
They have to take ownership of essentially the submission. Uh, and it's publicly disclosed. So if you end up with a publication that has serious flaws, um, as we have seen many examples during COVID, the reviewers that essentially let this turkey through the gate are identified just the same as the authors. I think that's the best. But there was this before this kind of formalized peer review fiction that this is all on the up and up was promoted back in late 1800s, early 1900s. The norm was that you really didn't have a peer review process.
Right.
You published your paper, and peer review is what happened after publication. You
Yeah.
either got spitwads or accolades or some mix in between.
Uh-huh.
And personally, I think that's more effective, but it requires that the people that are um, uh, reading and attempting to ascertain truth through that publication have a skeptical mind and a sufficient education in order to really comprehend it. And now in modern science and medicine, it the technology is so complex that really the only people that are qualified to review it are others who are basically inside the paradigm. I love
Yeah.
your reference to structure of scientific
Yeah.
revolutions. Is that by the very intrinsic structure of all this,
Yeah.
and especially with the grant and contract proposal process, the only people that are qualified really
Yeah.
to review it are people that have already bought into that metaphor, that paradigm,
Yeah.
and they will actively exclude
Yeah.
anything which challenges that paradigm because, of course, they're personally invested in it.
Right.
And so you end up with a form of selection bias in the review process that reinforces the continuation of certain scientific tropes, and then, as if that isn't bad enough, in the federal level, which is where I mean, all this money is either coming basically from pharma or from the feds. And pharma, of course, has its bias, just like the tobacco industry. Notoriously, it's kind of the same dynamic. But then in the federal review process, uh, you notoriously, Jill talks about this all the time. She used to work for somebody that worked in the National Institute of Drug Addiction, and I'll hold back the name. He was very clear that there was no way that they could publish any finding that showed that there was any benefit of agent X or Y, whether it was lysergic acid diethylamide or um, marijuana or an opioid or whatever. If you ever published anything that was showed some positive benefit associated with that agent, you would never receive funding from that agency again. because the agency has an intrinsic bias.
Yeah.
Agency is set up basically to prove a metaphor, a paradigm, an agenda, or whatever. And you, if you want to continue in your academic track,
Yeah.
because now most of us are on soft money, uh, then you had to validate the dominant paradigm, and woe behold, woe betide you if you were to in some way challenge it, unless it was in some way that had kind of been pre-vetted as okay by the Illuminati of whatever little splinter branch you were in.
Yeah.
So that's you want to talk
Right.
about.
One wonders what kind of reforms are going to happen after this. Of course, that's the big question we're all asking. But given the failure of this paradigm and the non-existence of independent scientists, I mean, I'm intrigued myself in Brownstone that most of the people who write for us and our scientists are themselves, in some sense, detached from the mainstream of the scientific profession. I mean, they're retired professors or they're out or whatever, and they're suddenly free to speak their minds. Do you have any comments on this, Brett?
Yeah, I actually want to sum up what Robert just said and connect it to what you said. It can be summed up as follows. It is inconceivable, maybe even arguably impossible, that the system as set up would produce science as its product. It just simply won't happen. And the reason for that is because the niche defines the creature that evolves in it, right? Every time we see a species, it is describing a niche that we can't see. And the university system is a niche, and it is perfectly constructed to create an arms race amongst parasites, and that's what it has done. And it has taken on the mantle of science, and it tells us all sorts of things because we are confused. We have been betrayed by our educations, and we have been led to understand that science is a consumable. It's not. You don't consume science, right? When Fauci says he is the science, he's telling you that he is delivering something to you, and you will consume it and do as you're told. That's not right. Science is a process. It has nothing to do with technology. Heather and I are well familiar with doing science where the only equipment that we have are rubber boots and a machete, right? Science can be done in a rainforest, and it can be done in the same way it's been done for thousands of years, maybe with a Baconian update, but you formulate hypotheses based on observations you have made. If the hypotheses are any good, if they're constructed properly, they make predictions that are not made by any other hypothesis, and then you go about seeing whether or not those predictions are manifest in the world. That's science.
Mm-hmm.
And when it worked, I want to make an argument. I am not arguing that we should go back to the age of gentlemen scientists, but I do want to point out one reason it worked better in that era. If you had dudes, and it was all dudes, really, right? If you had dudes who were wealthy enough to be able to spend time trying to figure out how the universe worked, they didn't have a perverse incentive because what they were looking for was immortality, right? They wanted to discover something that was durable enough that 500 years after they were dead, their name was still being discussed. That incentive isn't perfect, but it's really closely aligned with figuring out what's true. What we have now, you can make a brilliant career. You can, buy a second home and a boat and whatever, being wrong as long as nobody figures it out until after you're out of the system.
Wow.
Right? So yeah, we got the system we ordered.
I'm on for that.
Can I
Yeah.
jump in? So for me, I had a real dilemma as I encountered the nature of big science and the dynamics that were created with the Nobel Prize. And one of the conclusions I came to is just precisely that. It is all about immortality. That the insane competition that goes on is about somehow getting into the history books in a way that will give you immortality. And it results in people who are obsessed with their own status, obsessed with achieving recognition, and that's what they chase.
I don't think that happens to normal people.
You're being facetious.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. Most people in their normal lives don't think, well, how do I become immortal on this? I mean, through my reputation, that sort of thing. Do you?
It is So many things in our society select for personality profiles that are aligned with what we might call psychopathy or sociopathy.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And that happens in the world of science.
Scientists are are just the same as other humans.
Uh-huh.
And this whole idea of scientists as these noble individuals that are seeking truth
Yeah.
through the perils and travails of modern life, that's a
Yeah.
bunch of hooey.
Actually, I want to disagree with you on the first part of what you said. I do think there's a way in which scientists, good ones, are defective in one regard that then becomes a superpower with respect to figuring out what is actually true. And I have to credit my brother here who said something very brilliant to me early on, which was that truth is the second best strategy, right? The truth does give you power. If you understand how the universe works, you do have a leg up on people who don't, but it's not the best way of navigating the world. In general, being in sync with your social milieu, right? Your your population is extracting value from the world, it's creating wealth. And if you are well positioned within it, it doesn't matter that you're well positioned within it by virtue of the fact that you believe a lot of things that aren't true, right? You can still do very well positioned in a society that is producing wealth if you are well positioned within it. A scientist is the annoying person who really wants to figure out what is true, even if it puts you in an awkward spot or it takes 200 years for it to produce any wealth and it's all cost in the meantime. So it is a matter of sort of, yeah, the true science, right. And I'm not arguing that this is, I mean, really, I like it. This is what I like to do. But what I'm arguing is that it's not, there are eras when it's the right way to approach a problem, and there are eras when it's deadly. And we are living in an era where we're trying to resurrect that scientific impulse, and we should be looking for all of the people who remember how to do it. And there aren't very many. That's what you're learning. I mean,
Yeah.
your expert class has just revealed
Yeah.
you don't know anything about anything. Really, that's
Yeah.
not even an exaggeration.
Well, I only understand the economics profession really well, and it was a complete shock to me to see the failure of all academic economists over the last 4 years. And the way they would twist themselves into knots to try to justify whatever the prevailing status quo of the powers that be happen to be,
So same thing happens in
I see.
science.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What you said, use this phrase, the age of the gentleman scientist, and I'm not actually familiar with that phrase. And so, what age was that?
Well, I mean, take Darwin, right? Darwin was kind of a failure. I don't want to say ne'er-do-well, but there was sort of an aspect in which he couldn't really find anything to be productive about. He was obsessed with little observations. He had the advantage of his grandfather's notes that sort of hinted in the direction of evolution. And literally, the history of the study of evolution is born when he gets a position as someone for the captain of the Beagle to dine with so he wouldn't be bored by all of these sailors who, were basically just hired brutes, right? That's what he was. He was a companion for the captain. And he wanted to know. He had an insatiable curiosity that had gotten in the road. It had made it impossible for him to become a doctor, right? He wasn't going to be an effective clergyman. And so we lucked out that he, happened through the Galapagos, and that the Galapagos told this story in a much clearer way than other places did. And he could compare it to mainland South America. And, he did have Erasmus's thoughts in his head, and all of these things resulted in us coming to understand what we now see as arguably the greatest theory anyone's ever had. But the point is, it wasn't a career.
Uh-huh.
It was something to do.
Yeah.
He didn't need a career. He was rich.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, Wallace tells the other side of the story, because Wallace wasn't rich. And I will point out there's a very odd little fact. If you read The Origin of Species, you will find that the first thing that Darwin does is he asks his community to take care of Wallace. He acknowledges that Wallace is right on the right track, and he doesn't really want Wallace to get credit for the idea because he believes he's been there first, but he does want Wallace taken care of because he knows that Wallace has that mindset and that he's figured it out. He's seen the same deep truth. That would never happen today. The cutthroat nature of what we currently call science would not allow that. And in fact, the person who does get credit now is very often not someone who had anything to do with the insight that we got. It's somebody who's figured out how to parasitize the system to take advantage of their postdocs and their graduate students, or to see somebody else's idea come through peer review, snuff it out so you never get any evidence that that idea was in the air beforehand, and then they publish it under their name. And I will point out that when you have a system that doesn't award credit correctly, it doesn't evolve in the direction of getting smarter either.
Interesting. Robert, do you want to comment on any aspect of that?
No.
Okay.
I'm trying to be polite, correct, and not bitter. So, right. So the trying to take it up a notch,
Yeah.
for me, and not just get down in the weeds. Uh, the concept of paradigm shift
Yeah.
teaches us that a friend of mine who is a big shot, a multi-million-dollar biotech investor developer once said, "Don't be a pioneer. All pioneers get is arrows in the ass." And
They get what in the ass?
arrows. It's a
Arrows.
It's to the American West.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, Confederacy and all.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but the key point here, to make it a little more academic, is that if you study the structure of scientific revolutions and
Yeah.
paradigm shifts, being a pioneer is high risk, low yield.
Yeah.
The place to be is an early adopter.
Yeah.
As you see that the new paradigm is starting to gain momentum, it has merit, then you want to jump in at that point. If you are of this kind of bent, where you're looking to take advantage of opportunity.
Earlier in your career.
Whenever
Yeah.
The proper thing to do if you're focused on return on investment is to be a early adopter, not a pioneer.
Yeah.
And so one could make the argument that this kind of avaricious opportunism that is rampant, that is enabled by the financial structures where you have increasingly, one of the dynamics that people aren't aware of is that the federal funding goes to fewer and fewer larger and larger laboratories headed up by one kingpin. That's how that structure exists. And so if you are one of those kingpins that control, typically somebody was talking to me the other day, well, I think if we only put $200 million into cancer, we could do this. And I'm like, $200 million is hardly a drop in the bucket. Any of these big labs are managing 10, 20, $30 million a year. So if you're sitting on that pool of capital and you're typically an editor, I mean, this is the dynamic I saw with my own mentor. He was the editor of Proceedings of the National Academy of Science and editor of one of the major oncology journals. And he would get sent important manuscripts, say from Nature. And he would intentionally hold those manuscripts back until his postdocs had duplicated the finding. And then he would say, oh, we've got the same thing if it's a valid thing. And then he would submit, so he would get basically co-publication. The dynamics of how this ecosystem works is so distorted that those that are on the outside thinking that this is an ivory tower of purity and thought have absolutely no idea. I cut my teeth on HIV, or what was originally LAV. I was there with all the dynamics with Bob Gallo and Luc Montagnier and my mentor, et cetera, the ugly stuff that went on. I mean, beyond the Tony Fauci things that we have learned about from Bobby Kennedy and others. It's just, what has happened under this system is a gross perversion of what the likes of us naively believe to be a valid process. The reason why I'm inferring But for me, the reason why I went into this is because I thought it was this um, paragon of truth and scholarship and thought and labor and contribution to society in the future. It's none of that. At least from my cynical personal experience, it
Yeah.
may be at the level of people working in local liberal arts colleges, in kind of working off on the side, kind of akin to what Brett's talking about. Those people still exist, but they are, scratching for $10,000 or $20,000 here and there in donations, and not able to operate in the world that we're in. And then on top of that, what we've learned, and we talked about this in the new book, and we talked about it on Substack, and I wasn't the original scholar. There's a group that rigorously dug into who owns the journals, and most of the major journals have direct ties to boom,
Yeah.
World Economic Forum.
Oh, uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. I did not know.
Yeah.
The publishing racket, of course, is just, astonishing in every field. It's ruined economics for sure, and I'm sure it's ruined everything else. One of the strangest things about the last 4 years is the way well-established scientists who dissented from the prevailing paradigm shift that suddenly happened to us in the middle of March were shouted down and hounded, no matter what their reputations were in the past. So,
Crowdstocked, intentionally crowdstocked using federal funding.
what do you mean crowdstock?
Crowdstocked. You're not familiar with Shots Heard Around the World or the Public Good Projects.
No, oh, no.
There's a bunch of people here that have been subjected to it.
Yeah.
So they set up the Foundation for CDC through the Public Good Project, set up an organization that's still operating called Shots Heard Around the World.
Oh.
Shots Heard Around the World then solicited other scientists and physicians who were pro-narrative, government narrative.
Yeah.
And then they would send out email blasts saying Jeffrey Tucker or Bret Weinstein has said something that is, the subtext contrary to the narrative, but they wouldn't say it that way. So he's spouting that crazy misinformation again. We all need to attack him and report him to his medical board or whatever the organization. That people aren't aware that this was methodically done. This is crowd stalking. It's actually
I see.
Crime.
Stalking. I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, apparently this happened to John Ioannidis because, I think it was late March of 2020. You remember that first article he wrote that came out and said, look, I just don't, and he's, one of the, well, I guess one of the most cited scientists there is, right? And
Might be the most published, is that
most published, yeah, something like that. And he came out with this article that appeared in, a major space, I forget now the name of the journal, but that said, look, I just don't think there's enough evidence to justify what we're doing. That was all he said, right? And suddenly he was shouted down. He was the enemy of the day. And he was saying nothing other than what everybody said.
Paul Merrick is a great case study.
Yeah.
Mary Bowden is a great case study.
Yeah.
The lovely thing is some of this is starting to come out because of committees like the Committee on the Weaponization of Government and the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which in their recent report this October, stunning read, everybody should go. It's the report that covers the Forest Marsh, literally $1 billion
contract,
warfare contract.
Yeah.
It says an explicit statement coming from Energy and Commerce
that
the government should never again silence scientific voices.
Yeah. Yeah, $1 billion paid to an ad agency that did nothing but market.
Calling them an ad agency is generous. Forest Marsh is a propaganda agency. That's what they do.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was 2020 and 2021 when the origin of the Great Barrington Declaration. I'm not sure how many people know this, but it was Martin Kulldorff was expressing frustration that the journalists didn't seem to understand anything about the subject that they were covering, and and so he wanted to hold a little event for journalists just to educate them on the basics of public health. That was it. And he said, well, bring in a couple of friends, and we'll have a conference. And he asked me to send out the notes to everybody. So I sent out about 50 notes to all the top reporters, the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and wherever, all the places, British Medical Journal and so on, with the expectation that they would, shows how unbelievably naive I was, that they would be thrilled to learn from the top 3 epidemiologists in the world about pandemics and public health, and that they would all be sitting at their feet and they would teach them over a couple of days. Then the news, then after that, everything would change, because then they would know what they were talking about, and we would get out of this nonsense. So I sent 50 emails out, and not a single one was answered. I mean, not one. I didn't even get a people declining the invitation, which was a shock. So I had to call up friends and say, could you come to this event, And lacking a real audience, then we had to record it. And then, not knowing what to do then, they finally said, well, we should just write a short statement of public health principles, and put that out. That's how it happened. It was supposed to be an education. It wasn't an anti-vaccine plot. I'm sorry. Sorry to disappoint you.
Fauci, his
Deep
recent
State.
testimony again vilified it.
Yeah.
But there's something frustrating about that chapter, because as far as I know, we have never really had a conversation about what happened under the banner of public health. And so the attempt to rescue what is now called public health, to me, is it's the enemy we must defeat. Public health now, to its credit, has how many million deaths that are the result of the misuse of this modality to override medicine? And most people don't really even realize that medicine and public health are actually competing modalities, and that there was a coup, right? You're supposed to have an interaction with your doctor, and we're supposed to talk about your health and what you should do about it. And then there's a bunch of stuff at population level that can't be done at the level of individual interactions between doctors and patients. So in theory, there's a lot of good to be done over in public health, but somebody discovered that there was also an excuse for lying and overriding your doctor, telling your doctor what to do and how to do it. And so I don't think public health is rescuable. And what meager successes it had during COVID, the few bright spots are so overwhelmed by the amount of terror that was delivered as if it was about public health. It did the opposite. It's almost impossible to imagine that the field of public health, if it did nothing but good for the rest of eternity, could undo as much harm, that it could overwhelm that harm with new good. I don't see it. So at some level, I want to be free of public health from here on out, even though I get why, in theory, there are circumstances in which it might be beneficial.
Sure.
So to illustrate the point, the birth of the CDC is intimately interwoven with the Tuskegee experiment. The logic of the Tuskegee experiment is an exemplar of exactly what Bret's talking about. That the MPH degree, which doesn't actually require any real understanding of medicine or biology, okay, it's more about statistics, data analysis, and a frame of reference that is, as he points out correctly, population level. And so the ethics in that world are that the ends justify the means, that it's for the greater good, that things which can be justified as marginally better at the population level need to be implemented in this exchange that Bret's talking about.
When was the CDC, when was that experiment, and when was the CDC codified as an agency?
It's not.
Well,
No, seriously.
Yeah, okay.
That's one of the things that came out that I didn't know
Oh.
in the McMurray-Roger report, is the CDC has never actually been sanctified as an agency. Okay, it doesn't technically exist as a formal federal agency because Congress never acted to create it. It's kind of a bureaucratic creation fiction.
Well, what's
And
your
the Tuskegee transactions, I think, was 40s, 50s.
so
ending in the 70s, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
extended for a very long time because they followed these poor souls that were either infected or allowed to be infected,
Yeah.
basically until death.
Yeah. Well, I know that in 1946 we had the public was the Public Health something act that was passed, and I've not seen any legislative history on that, but that was the very first time in American history the federal government assumed quarantine powers. Would have been in 1946. I have no idea.
Is that right? Because I
Yeah.
thought the Supreme Court precedent that's been cited
Uh,
was way back.
yeah, well, the Supreme Court precedent applied to state law, but there had never been a federal permission for the federal government
Okay.
to have a quarantine power until the Public Health Services Act of 19. I'm saying 46. It might have been 44. So that was without precedent.
So can we just recognize the gamble that we are making on public health?
Yeah.
Just think about it as it actually stands. Because it really is, if you squint at it correctly, kind of like health communism, right?
It's absolutely socialistic.
We are allowed to do something to you for the benefit of somebody else. We are allowed to give an mRNA vaccine to a child in order to protect grandma, right? Now, it's possible that there are cases in which the risk to the child might be so low and the benefit to the grandma might be so great that we might think it's worth it. But we never had that conversation. And somebody did tell us that we had to vaccinate all sorts of healthy people who stood to gain absolutely nothing from these shots. They were healthy. They weren't going to suffer terribly from COVID. Having an interaction with COVID was going to give them natural immunity. And we robbed them of that capacity on the theoretical basis of protecting vulnerable people, right? We transferred health from people with long, healthy lives ahead of them to people who were infirm and heading towards death anyway. That was not acceptable. And it was done because of this underlying rationale for quote unquote public health. It's a transfer from some people to other people.
Okay, I'm going to pick at that. I think it's worse than that. Okay,
Robert just said it's worse than that, which I'm all ears.
That was the superficial justification. But so we've documented that there was something like 7,000 federally funded peer-reviewed academic studies on how to overcome vaccine hesitancy. There was a major one done at Yale that involved, I think it was 5 or 6 arm clinical trial. The clinical trial was as big as the phase 2 trials that were done, or bigger, for the vaccines, but the testing was on messaging. They were testing messaging on the public to infer or determine statistically which messages would produce the greatest response in terms of compliance with vaccine uptake.
Incredible.
So the goal was to promote vaccine uptake. And what they found in these studies, particularly this Yale one, was that this precise messaging that he's talking about and the messaging that you should do this for your community rather than to benefit yourself was the most persuasive in terms of achieving the endpoint of vaccine uptake. The whole thing was predicated on 2 key theses. One was that this is a highly lethal virus.
Yeah.
A falsehood.
Yeah, universally lethal, right?
Yeah.
For everybody, right.
Yeah. I had a chat, people don't know this, I had a teleconference with Nancy Pelosi in which I begged her to get CDC to stratify the risk data.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Right.
There was a full awareness
Yeah.
that was the norm. It should be done,
Right.
and it was intentionally not done. I don't know how else to.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't part of this based on the pharmaceutical definition of herd immunity of 70%, and that is presuming.
No, that's falsehood.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So that herd immunity is something that can be specifically calculated. It has to do. So Bret can. This is math, okay, kind of like economics.
Yeah.
Okay. Herd immunity has to do with how the level of protection afforded to a population to reduce the reproductive coefficient below 1.
Okay.
Okay. So you can actually calculate it rather precisely.
Yeah.
And the 70% that was floated, notoriously by Tony Fauci, was something that he just pulled out of a dark space.
Okay.
And then you'll recall that when they achieved so the other predicate to all this was that the products were safe and effective,
Right.
right?
Right.
90+% effective.
So I have a really foundational question for both of you because I cannot resolve this in my head. I mean, we know that we've learned very quickly the vaccine did not stop infection. We know it didn't stop the transmission, obviously. I'm not sure we knew how damaging it would be. My question for both of you is did anybody really believe before the vaccine was distributed that it would actually work? Were they,
What do you mean, anybody?
well, the people who were the Pfizer, Moderna, the people who were pushing this vaccine, was there a belief extant, it was an orthodox belief within the community that was pushing these vaccines, that the vaccine would in fact stop transmission and would in fact stop infection?
I think you want to ask the question the other way. Was there an elite who knew better? I believe there was. Does not mean there were not people who believed it and pushed it and played their role in the machine. But was there a group of people who were sophisticated enough to know that from the get-go this was not going to function? Yes, and I believe you can see that in the treatment of the repurposed drugs, which in the U.S. is the last piece of the narrative to give way. It's still in force. People still think ivermectin was promising and it didn't work. Hydroxychloroquine was too dangerous to use, not effective. And the real question, which I think, we've sort of been struggling to get to the answer of, is why was the suppression of these things so great? And you've no doubt heard, had we had an alternative treatment that was effective, there would have been no EUA. I did believe that, but I no longer believe it. I don't believe it.
What do you say, Robert?
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Their ability to cheat in the system is so sophisticated that would not have been a meaningful obstacle. But what it would have done is if people had understood ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine are highly effective against RNA viruses generally. They were effective against SARS-1. There was every reason to think they were going to be effective against SARS-2, and they were. It even shows in the studies that you were told falsified the idea that they worked. If you look at the data rather than the conclusion, you'll see it's there. The effect is almost impossible to erase. It's that powerful. So if we had been allowed to access those drugs, if your doctor had been allowed to say, I'm not so sure about what I'm hearing about this shot, maybe you ought to try ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, there would have been a large number of people who experimented with these things, discovered that this disease was totally manageable. They needed it to be scary. It was totally manageable. And then there would have been a large control group, and we would have no trouble at all figuring out how dangerous these things were, because there would be those people who defaulted to the repurposed drugs and those people who took the shots. And what they've done is they've made it much harder to see that, because the disease was scarier, because people didn't have a remedy. So the doctors all got on board with the shots. And that's what I think happened.
And people didn't know about this age stratification. I mean, even now,
So one of the things that I sense has yet to really penetrate your conscious mind, I'm sure you understand it subconsciously, is how evil the pharmaceutical industry is. So that in its structure, okay, if you're working in pharma on a drug which you are seeking approval for, the rule is you never do any test unless the FDA insists that you do it, because you might get the wrong answer and you would blow a billion-dollar product or whatever. You'd get fired. Okay, you never do a study unless the FDA requires it. And here's how this plays out. Have you ever looked into the history and career of Peter Marks?
no.
Okay, there's two people responsible for Operation Warp Speed.
Uh-huh.
It's Bob Cadlick, who was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response,
Yep.
and Peter Marks, largely. Okay, they were the ones that advocated for it. Peter Marks was rapidly elevated in the hierarchy of science. He's a member of the National Academy and in FDA because of one thing. He advocated that there were too many regulations, too many restrictions on pharma at the FDA. And this is something that it's like it's like sugar for a Republican. You can't say in the face of somebody who's advocating for reduced
Yeah, I get it.
regulations, you just have a knee-jerk response.
Yeah.
Of course there needs to be reduced regulations, okay? And so Peter Marks ends up head of CBER, which is the branch that regulates vaccines, and along comes this thing, and there's all kinds of push inside the government to advance this new technology for a variety of different reasons, which has basically been funded by DARPA. They pulled it out of the trash can and rescued it, okay? And this is going to be the great savior of the whole biodefense industrial complex, this new tech. And we need to get it out there as soon as possible because we have this highly pathogenic virus that is such a huge threat. And so we've got the guy that is saying that the regulations in the pharmaceutical industry are inhibiting innovation, and we need to drop them. And we need to circumvent them. And now is the perfect, this is never let the crisis go to waste.
I get it. Yeah. So even under those under conditions where somebody came along and said, look, you cannot really stop a fast mutating respiratory virus with zoonotic reservoir through a shot. You cannot. The response might have been, that's probably true, but we need some way to deploy this mRNA technology.
Peter Marks is not an infectious disease guy. He's not an epidemiologist. He's naive about all of this tech.
So, I mean, under your, am I characterizing your view right that the purpose was to deploy the tech, not to fix the problem?
That's my inference.
That's also where I've landed.
That's some pretty dark stuff, right?
Not only to deploy, but to normalize it.
Yes.
Right.
Normalize and validate. And part of that is not just to normalize and validate mRNA as a platform. And by the way, that's now yesterday's news. The new tech is self-replicating RNA. So that's a whole other thing. But to normalize and validate gene therapy. The use, which they denied this was gene therapy, but basically you got the world in the face of this existential threat of death. It was actively promoted with, among other things, $1 billion program from Forrest Marsh. They specifically said they would amplify the fear of this virus in order to get compliance with the public policies. It's written into their contract. Okay. So they amplified this fear in order to get global uptake of something that, particularly notoriously Europeans, wanted nothing to do with. And everybody just got in line to take it.
So they also, I mean, the one that I just can't get past is the gaslighting of the vaccine injured. It seems to me that if you were an advocate for this technology and you admit that all medical treatments are going to have some rate of adverse effect, you would want to take care of the people who got unlucky in this process at the fullest extent possible. You would want to learn from them. You would want to make sure they got the best care so that everybody knew that, if you did what you were told and it didn't go well for you, that, you were going to have all the resources at your disposal. And instead, we told these people that it was in their head, that they're imagining the connection. And that tells you, as you say, how evil this industry is. So again, this is the rationale, though, is public health. Right? We have to get people.
There was an agreement between the United States government and the UK government that any information that would cause vaccine hesitancy would be suppressed, even if it was true.
Which means that people who were hurt weren't able to talk about it. Can you imagine a more diabolical thing than
it was censored
hurt and I can't discuss it?
Censored on social media.
No, more than censored, they were ridiculed and gaslit.
Ridiculed and gaslit.
When we did this thing, this Dark Horse podcast, How to Save the World, okay, after like I say, 3 old men sitting around a table for a couple hours and it goes viral. Something weird's going on. But what happens immediately afterwards is call after call after call of women who have experienced adverse events having to do with their reproductive cycle and menstruation, again and again and again, telling these stories, horror stories, loss of fetus, okay, and they're experiencing these harms. And they are being told that they're being hysterical, literally being told that they're being hysterical. I mean, this goes back to the 50s, use of this term hysterical, right, which referenced the uterus.
Yep.
They are being told that they are being hysterical, they're crazy, they're imagining things, and gaslighting doesn't even touch it.
Yeah.
What happened? It's an enormous.
This was already in 2021.
Yeah, right after, soon after the deployment.
And from the point of view of the rationale of public health, which is that in the end, more good will be done than harm, we vaccinated people with this shot, which if you got 2 of them, triggers IgG4, which actually reduces immunity if exposed to the antigen in question, which now means, I would point out, that an enemy who wishes to attach spike protein to some pathogen for weapons purposes now has a mechanism for getting the majority of the population of the West to get their immune system to turn itself down, right? So the amount of good that came out of this was deeply negative. The amount of harm that might come from it is astronomical. If there's anything that should cause us to be questioning the public health rationale, it's the consequences of this shot. But instead, what we have seen is foot on the gas. Right? That doesn't make any sense. If these people were caught off guard by the harm they did, they would have reversed course, and they didn't.
Bret, Robert.
Which plays right into the whole narrative of depopulation, et cetera. It gets really hard to reject those crazy conspiracy theories. All the data is consistent with their conspiracy theories.
Quite right.
That's right. We totally reject all those theories. Well, anyways, Robert, Bret, thank you so much. Thank you.